to Frog Question Friday.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast where we read and discuss questions submitted by you all about life, the universe, or anything else that might come up. My name is Ben Mursky, and this is Frog Question Friday. So this week, I wanted to talk about Pope Francis and the recent revision to the Catechism about capital punishment, or the death penalty. I haven't actually gotten a lot of questions about this recently, and to be honest, it's not even the biggest story in the Catholic Church right now, because there is a lot going on, and it's easy for topics like this to get overshadowed, but there was a revision to the Church's official teaching on capital punishment, and I think we need to discuss it at least just briefly. Sometimes it's easy to overlook things like this, and especially with the revision as it stands. I think normally Catholics are going to look at this revision and just kind of say, well, what's the big deal? There's no change here. And I actually think I would disagree. I think there is a pretty major change. I think that the Church's teaching has been changed drastically, and the extent to which I agree with this change is, I think it's kind of still up in the air. I was not able to get someone to come in and record this episode with me. I really wanted somebody to come in and kind of take the opposing side and argue with me, but I wasn't able to get anyone to do that. So today it's just me. So just keep in mind today it's my own personal opinions that are on display here. If you have feelings that are different from mine, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your perspectives, because obviously I only speak for myself. But let's dive in. So the death penalty is what we're talking about today. What is the death penalty? Obviously, what we're talking about here is the government's... does the government have a right to put someone to death, to kill someone, if that person has committed a very serious crime? Usually we're talking about murder or something on that level. So these very serious criminals, very dangerous criminals, can sometimes be legitimately executed, put to death by the government, which is it's an interesting thing that the government is able to do this. It's almost like the government has a monopoly on the act of murder. In a way, the government is saying to us, you all can't commit murder, but we can, which I think is interesting. Whether or not it is appropriate remains to be seen. So if we go back to the oldest law in the world, the oldest recorded human code of law, we'd find the Code of Hammurabi, which says an eye for an eye. So death penalty is really one of the oldest written laws that we have in existence. It calls for proportional punishments to the crime. So if you stab somebody in the eye, they get to stab you in the eye. It's a little bit brutal, but it's also extremely fair. In fact, it's pretty much only fair. That's the only positive thing about the Code of Hammurabi, because it doesn't take into account intent and these other things. If we go then throughout the Bible, we find a lot of similar arguments, presumably similar arguments in favor of the death penalty. So we can start in Genesis chapter 9. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man will his blood be shed, which, again, sounds kind of like the death penalty. We've got Sodom and Gomorrah, where you've got people committing crimes, and the entire cities are destroyed. We can step that up to Noah's Ark. You have the entire world, we're told, is committing serious crimes, and the entire world is wiped out. They're all killed. And then, of course, later, as the Israelites are traveling around, meeting and coming into contact with different people, like the Canaanites and the Philistines, we have this command from God to kill them. It's not just capture them or drive them out. It's kill them all. They're evil people. So we see a lot of examples of people who are presumed to be evil in the Bible, who are actually being killed for their actions. Seems like there's an argument here in favor of the death penalty. However, as we move on, especially as we get into the Christian Testament later on, we see a lot of arguments against the death penalty. We've got Matthew chapter 6. It says, if you do not forgive their sins, neither will the Father forgive your sins. Colossians 3, forgive as the Lord forgave you. All of this is kind of in the same vein, essentially, that when people do things wrong, we are to forgive them, not to exact revenge or exact punishment. Of course, we have Jesus himself, who says to turn the other cheek, and then does that. Jesus, obviously, I guess, bears repeating here, Jesus is the most famous victim of capital punishment in human history. He was executed by the government illegally. He was legally executed by legitimate authority. So Jesus was put to death under the death penalty. And this brings us now to what was the church's teaching. A lot of this original church's teaching comes to us from Evangelium Vitae, which was written by Pope John Paul II. These quotes are taken from 1995, the Evangelium Vitae 1995. And I'm just going to read this excerpt. This can get a little bit wordy, but just bear with me, because it's the letter of what we're reading here that actually does matter. So I'm going to read this, and then we'll talk about what that means. So this is paragraph 2267 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is the old version. So this is the version that cites from Evangelium Vitae, Pope John Paul II, and this is the version that has been changed. The section that has been changed, excuse me. 2267 reads, assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. If it is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. However, If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime, by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm, without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself, the cases in which the execution of the offender are an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Okay, so basically, I don't know whether you're able to get that or not. It's hard. I know it's hard to hear it read without actually seeing it in front of you, but essentially what the old version is saying here is that the Church has it teaches against the death penalty. It allows recourse to the death penalty. So it allows you to kill an aggressor in certain circumstances, but in general, the Church's teaching was anti-death penalty. So we have to ask, if there's all this evidence in the Bible that seems pro-death penalty, then why is the Church against it? And I think a big part of this, we're going to have to take a step out of biblical theology or biblical reasoning and actually take a look at logically what are the mechanics of punishment, law, crime, sin, and what does this all have to do with? It's all going to come down to, I think, salvation and redemption. But we start with the dignity of the human person. We believe that God has given each human person dignity. Each person has a right to their life, and at its core, we do have to ask the question, although it may be difficult to answer, we have to ask the question, what is the purpose of life at all? What is our purpose here on this planet? And I think any way we attempt to answer that question is going to lead us to the conclusion that human life is worth protecting. And that doesn't just mean innocent human life. It might also mean guilty human life. Earlier in the Catechism, I'll just cite this. This is the line just before that paragraph that I read. It says, when it is willingly accepted, punishment, when it is willingly accepted by the guilty party, it assumes the value of expiation. Punishment then, in addition to defending public order and protecting people's safety, has a medicinal purpose. As far as possible, it must contribute to the correction of the guilty party. In other words, the punishment isn't just to make you sit in a corner and think about what you did. It's not just to hurt you. It's also to help you. The purpose of punishing a criminal is to help that criminal become a better person. Now, this does not mean we release the criminal back into the public, but it does mean we give that person time to redeem themselves, maybe in the eyes of God, maybe in the eyes of just in their own eyes. And of course, we're all working towards salvation. We don't will the damnation of any person, even though sometimes it might be fun. sometimes it's nice to think of people burning in hell. It makes us feel better. It's definitely not what God wants. God has created us all to have dignity and to be loved. And our closure, if we are the victims of violent crime, especially, our closure needs to come from within ourselves, not from the punishment or the death of the criminal, the violent actor. And I think it would really be helpful if you haven't heard my podcast episode on Hitler. Will Hitler go to heaven? Or the follow-up to that, will Moana go to hell? I think those might be helpful episodes to listen to before continuing on with this one. So if you want to pause this here and go listen to those episodes, I will wait. I'll be here when you get back. But basically, I think that we've been raised with a lot of inaccuracies in the way that we view heaven and hell. We really have to ask, what does the afterlife look like? Because I think we have a lot of trite expressions that kind of paint this weird Sunday school picture, and I don't think we ever actually stop and think about the reality of what we're doing. Murderers especially don't think through the afterlife. Just imagine a situation where I hate somebody so much that I can't stand to be around them one more second, so I murder them, I kill them. I'm sending them into the afterlife, which is where I am soon to be headed. And the logic of saying I can't be around you one more second, I want to remove you from life, it's just kind of crazy, because we're soon to spend eternity together. And if I can't accept the presence of that person, I can't expect to enter into that kind of afterlife, at least not the afterlife that they're in. So, and this is the logic I kind of went through with Hitler, which is why we don't say with absolute certainty that Hitler is in hell, because there's obviously a possibility for redemption for any person, but it is very likely that he's in hell because of his personality and his outlook and his unwillingness to forgive or accept forgiveness. And forgiveness is just a really key part here. So yes, violent actors, while they may not end up in heaven, it seems like there's a lot of evidence that these people will not be redeemed or accept redemption, at least. We also have to consider ourselves. We need to be able to forgive to end up in heaven, which means we even need to be able to forgive people who have acted violently against ourselves or our families. And if someone has killed in a violent way, killed a member of my family, it can feel nice. It can feel good on earth to have that person put to death and to imagine that person burning in hell for all of eternity. But in this situation, I'm not moving on. Like, this isn't closure. We are lied to by the government sometimes and told that this is closure, that this should help us, but it doesn't. Watching somebody else die doesn't bring back my loved one, and in a greater sense, it doesn't even help me move on. It helps me, in fact, cling to this hate. Remember, Jesus said, I believe it was in Matthew, Jesus said, I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is liable to punishment, as though, the implication here, as though you've killed them. What sends you to hell is not the act of murder, it's the hate that you have for that person. And just because the state is the one carrying out the murder doesn't mean we aren't in some ways partially responsible if we're holding on to that hate and that anger. So let's move on to Pope Francis's revision here. This happened on August 11th. Pope Francis posted a revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church that slightly changes the teaching here. Now, the Church has always been anti-death penalty. I already read the paragraph that says it was anti-death penalty. It just allowed for some possibility in some circumstances. So Pope Francis's revision is going to change this kind of drastically and limit the use of the death penalty to basically never. But I'll read this now for you. So this is the revision to paragraph 2267. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there's an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of a very serious crime. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she worked with determination for its abolition worldwide. So some bigger words in there, but basically Pope Francis is saying no death penalty. It is never permissible, never in any circumstances permissible. So a lot of people's reaction to this was basically, so what? The Church has always been against the death penalty. Pope Francis just strengthened the language and made it, extra inadmissible, I guess. And then there was some strong objection to this. So there was then a letter that was published in First Things. This was 4 days later, on the 15th of August. There was a letter that came out in First Things that it was signed by a bunch of theologians and priests who were objecting to Pope Francis's teaching. And so I will read that, and then we will talk about what exactly is going on here and why it's important. So this is the letter from these theologians. To their most reverend eminences, the cardinals of the Holy Roman Church. Since it is a truth contained in the Word of God and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium of the Catholic Church, that criminals may lawfully be put to death by the civil power when it is necessary to preserve the just order in civil society, and since the present Roman Pontiff has now more than once publicly manifested his refusal to teach this doctrine, and has rather brought a greater confusion upon the Church by seeming to contradict it, and by inserting into the Catechism of the Catholic Church a paragraph which will cause, and is already causing, many people, both believers and non-believers, to support that the Church considers contrary to the Word of God that capital punishment is intrinsically evil, we call upon your eminences to advise His Holiness that it is his duty to put an end to this scandal, to withdraw this paragraph from the Catechism, and to teach the Word of God unadulterated, that we state our conviction that this is a duty seriously binding upon yourselves before God and before the Church, sincerely, and then it's a bunch of names. And I take that back, actually. I'm sorry. This is not addressed to the Pope specifically. This is addressed to the cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, so all the cardinals. And these theologians are asking that the revision be taken out because the Bible teaches that capital punishment is fine. So, So one big objection to this revision is that it is a contradiction, that it's one pope contradicting another pope. And a lot of this comes back to papal infallibility, which is, I'm just going to read, this is a quote from Vatican I. It's basically saying the Pope can't make mistakes. The Pope can't make mistakes, and this is a quote, when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. So when the Pope is teaching about faith or morals, he is infallible or he can't make mistakes. And the death penalty is obviously a doctrine that concerns faith or morals. It concerns morals, and he is sort of, this seems to represent a change from Pope John Paul II's teaching to Pope Francis's teaching. And a lot of people say, well, this is a contradiction. The magisterium has contradicted itself. What people aren't understanding here, though, and it's important to get this, is that infallibility isn't just like a blanket statement that the Pope can't make mistakes ever, and that the Pope can't hold his own opinions, or that the opinions of the Pope have to be held by everybody. This is a quote from Pope John the 23rd. He said, "I'm only infallible when I speak infallibly, and I will never do that. So I am not infallible." Which I think this is an apt summary of the Church's teaching on papal infallibility. The Pope is only infallible or only speaks on behalf of the whole Church in a way that cannot contain error when he is making a sweeping infallible statement or speaking ex cathedra. It involves very formal language, a formal process. you use a very specific language, like we declare. In fact, it's a very clear. I looked up the actual language you use, and I now it's escaping my brain, but it's a very clear and very formal process by which the Pope declares something infallibly, and we don't see that here. This is just a revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The last time we have an official infallible statement declared by the Church was in 1950, which was on the Assumption of Mary. That was the last time that a pope spoke infallibly. So we haven't had any infallible statements since then. And furthermore, if any pastor or bishop or even a pope makes an opinionated statement about doctrine, even if it is about faith or morals, and they're not speaking ex cathedra, the Church is allowed to disagree. We're allowed to argue and we're allowed to disagree. And so this isn't a situation where we have one pope who is violating the infallibility of another pope. These are just popes who have two slightly different opinions about the death penalty, whose statements have been included in the Catechism of the Catholic Church at different times. And the Church at different times can argue. There's nothing wrong with arguing. This is how the Church moves forward. In fact, the history of the Catholic Church is a history of people arguing with each other. So there's nothing wrong with what's going on right now. Pope Francis is allowed to disagree with Pope John Paul II, and the theologians who posted the letter and First Things are allowed to disagree with Pope Francis. No one's committing heresy here. No one's getting excommunicated. This is just sort of an ongoing debate. So this actually has gotten me a little bit worked up, which is why I wanted to record this episode today. And I wanted somebody to discuss this with me so that I could have kind of an argument or an open exchange. But there's a lot of components here that are kind of upsetting to me. The worst thing about everything that I've read so far, I think, is this letter and First Things. Now, I'm going to get to a point where I actually am going to take a stance that is a little bit opposed to Pope Francis's revision. I get where Pope Francis is going with the revision, but I think it's overlooking some things. But before I get to my perspective, I want to address this letter from First Things, because the letter is basically holding that the Word of God, or the Bible, teaches that capital punishment is fine, and that the Pope is contradicting the Bible by taking this position, to which I can't believe that there are even legitimate theologians who would hold this opinion. And my only response to this is, are you serious? Are you serious? You're calling yourselves theologians, and you're going to take the argument that the Church condones capital punishment, quoting Genesis chapter 9, and completely overlooking everything that Jesus says. You're going to say that the Christians have to hold the perspective that capital punishment is a good or an acceptable recourse, just because of this one section. This is a classic example of people picking and choosing which parts of the Bible to read. The Bible, as usual, is going to have pieces that would possibly support the death penalty, most of them in the Hebrew scriptures, and there's going to be parts of the Bible that don't support the death penalty, most of them in the Christian scriptures. At the end of the day, you can't just cite the Bible and say the Bible teaches this. This is going to come down to the fact that the Bible is a moral framework, and we have to use context clues from the Bible. So the context of the Bible, the context of what Jesus said, and we have to draw our own conclusions about these things. The Bible isn't the end-all be-all for morality, because the Bible doesn't have something to say on every moral issue. Human cloning, for example, is never addressed in the Bible. Why? Because human cloning wasn't an issue at the time Jesus was alive, so he doesn't say anything about it. It certainly wasn't an issue back in Genesis, I guess, unless you count that Adam and Eve situation. But the point is that not every moral issue is contained in the Bible, or the Bible doesn't explicitly say something about every moral issue. So we have to make up some of these decisions on our own. And when we're left to our own devices, when we start using logic, we arrive at, and again, I'll cite my podcast on Is Hitler in Heaven? it's not our place to judge. First of all, it's definitely not our place to judge who goes to heaven and hell, but it's not even our place to judge who lives and who dies. This is an incredibly serious act. We're talking about taking somebody out of the world, especially someone who's recently committed a serious crime. This is someone who needs redemption and who needs forgiveness more than anyone else in the world, and we're just going to kill them. I can't believe that any serious theologian would. These are people who have doctorates in theology, who don't understand theology, who don't understand the Bible. I try to give everyone a fair ear. I try to hear everyone's perspective equally. I don't find anything in this letter and First Things that I can respect. I can't believe that there are so many legitimate names of legitimate theologians on this list. These people are idiots. Okay, but let's move on now. Pope Francis's teaching. Unfortunately, and I'm just going to get more and more worked up, but I am also going to take slight issue here with the Pope's teaching. I am not at all agreeing with the letter and First Things. However, I am going to take issue with the Pope's teaching. So if we to explain my perspective here, we need to go back to the Catechism itself and look at what is actually changing here, because the original teaching said you really shouldn't kill people. Capital punishment is bad. You should only do it in very rare circumstances, and it said very rare, if not practically non-existent. So the original version said basically don't do it. The new version says definitely don't do it. So what does that mean for us? And I think for us in the United States, nothing actually has changed. But we have to remember that the Pope doesn't just write to the United States. The Pope is writing to a worldwide audience. So we have to actually look at the two different versions of the Catechism and actually narrow down what is actually changing and what circumstances are actually being eliminated here where it's okay to use the death penalty. So if we dive into paragraph 2267, I'm not going to read all this again, but I will read one line. Or it's a couple lines here. 2267. It says the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. So the Church will allow death penalty in a very specific circumstance, and it's right here. If this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. The only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the aggressor. What the Church is protecting here is the safety of the public, and in the case of the United States, we have a prison system that is very efficient. Now, the conditions in prisons, whether you say the justice system is fair, these are all completely different questions, and I will accept that the justice system is not always fair. I absolutely accept that prison conditions are terrible. But these are different moral issues. The question here of the death penalty is, do we kill someone or do we send them to prison? And what the Church is teaching in the original version of the Catechism is that if we're able to send someone to prison and keep them there in order to protect public safety, then we should do that. We only kill someone if we literally can't contain them. Like there's no room in the prisons, or maybe we don't have a prison system. So again, the United States does not fall into this category. In fact, we're so spoiled, we can't even imagine what a situation like that would look like. Unfortunately, there are places in the world where this is very real. If we go to developing nations, or if we can even imagine hypothetical situations where government doesn't really have teeth. There is no prison system, either because the public can't fund it, there's not enough money, or not enough resources, there's just not a building that can contain people. You do have very small nations where there is no prison system. And in that case, what do you do with violent offenders, especially people who are mentally disturbed, who won't stop killing? And I know this is kind of an edge case, but that's what we're talking about. This whole argument hinges on edge cases because the original Catechism didn't say, yeah, kill whoever you want. It said only use it in these edge cases, and then the new version says never use it. So this entire discussion is going to hinge on edge cases, and in this case, what we're talking about is people who are mentally disturbed, who will not stop killing, who, if released, will continue to kill people, and continue to harm the public. And the original version of the Catechism says, if you can't contain these people because you don't have a prison, or for some other reason they can't be contained, the only other thing you can do, your only other choice, is let them go or kill them. then you're allowed to kill them. And the purpose here is not punishment. It's not like you did something bad, here's your slap on the wrist, and by the way, it's not a slap on the wrist, we're killing you. This is not about punishing the aggressor. It's about protecting the people. So even as we are pulling the trigger, even as we're executing this person, we're not happy that it's happening, and we're not rejoicing that a criminal's been killed. We're actually sad because ideally we could keep this person alive and maybe they would eventually redeem themselves. But in this very narrow edge case, we have to kill them in order to protect the public. That is what Pope Francis has officially declared inadmissible in the church. This has nothing to do with larger developed nations like the United States. This is saying that in all cases, including situations where killing someone is the only way to protect the public, those are the words from the original, these are the words that Pope Francis felt needed to be changed. The only way to protect the public, the only means to protect the public, you're not allowed to do it even then. This teaching is basically saying that if someone is a violent aggressor who you know is going to commit murder in the future, they just have to be released. You just let them go back out into the public, and if they continue killing, that's on them. Now, obviously, I'm taking issue with this, and I disagree with it, and I know it seems like I'm again, diving into very rare circumstances, which I am, but we have to dive into the rare circumstances because, again, rare is literally the word used in the original teaching of the Catechism. The circumstances where we use capital punishment are rare if practically non-existent. The first teaching is literally only allowing one loophole, which is for violent offenders who can't be contained by a prison. So that is the thing that Pope Francis looked at and said, no, we even want to let those people go. Now, a couple of things. One, I don't think Pope Francis actually thought this through. If he did, I would have maybe bigger issues with this decision. I think this was just looking at it and similar to church teachings like abortion that say that this act is intrinsically evil, we can never do it, we just have to limit it. He just wanted to use stronger language about a topic he felt very strongly about, which I can appreciate. But even with things like abortion that the church teaches are universally wrong, we do have edge cases like ectopic pregnancies where the fetus doesn't actually make it to the womb, to the uterus. It implants in the fallopian tube and then has to be removed surgically. I mean, that's something that it's maybe splitting hairs, but I mean, let's just call it what it is. Like this is an abortion, but it's an abortion where there's no other means of protecting the fetus. If the fetus is allowed to continue developing, the mother and the fetus will both die. So we perform the abortion not killing the fetus, not for the convenience of the mother or for anyone else involved. It's to protect the mother, because if we let the fetus continue to develop, everyone's going to die. That's the same. It's basically the same situation, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, where now this is a full-grown adult who we are killing, not because we're punishing the person, but because we're protecting society. Okay, so this summarizes. I think this is a very quick summary at the Church's teaching from 1995, Pope Francis's revision here just recently, and the objections from the idiots at First Things, and then my own objections to both that letter very strongly, and then also partially to the Pope's teaching. Now, if there was someone here who would argue with me, which there isn't, and I really wish, I'd love to hear. I don't just like to listen to myself talk. I like to hear other people's perspectives. And I think if there was somebody here who would argue with me and take the position that no, we really should never be killing people ever, I think that argument would look something like this. It would be based on the gospel's pretty clear teaching against violence towards pacifism. And I think that's the direction you would have to end up going ultimately, to believe that you should actually let a violent criminal go instead of killing them in a situation where there is no prison system. I think you really have to take a hardline pacifist approach, which I'm not totally objecting to. I would appreciate if there was someone who would take that argument, and I would love to argue with that person. Again, I'm not arguing from a position of being bloodthirsty here. I don't want to see people die, and even very violent criminals, I don't think that they deserve to die, or that death is a good punishment for them. This is all about protecting society. So my argument would be based on that. Although I do understand and I can appreciate the argument for pacifism, which obviously Pope Francis is an extreme proponent of pacifism, and his argument may very well be about pacifism. These are just different ways of approaching the moral framework surrounding the dignity of life. And I would love to have that argument. We'll have to put it off for another day until there's somebody who wants to argue with me about pacifism, which I think would be a great topic. But anyway, that's all we've got for today. So this does conclude our show for today. In conclusion, I would recommend that you go and read the Catechism's teaching. Again, this is paragraph 2267. Read the original version, read Pope Francis's revision. You can read the First Things letter if you want. But just read it, see if there's anything I'm missing. You can write into frogquestions@gmail.com. Let me know if there's anything that I left out or anything that I wasn't fair in my treatment of. If you think I'm a heretic, I would love to hear that I'm a heretic. I just love having these conversations, and today it's just me by myself. So let me know what you think. If you'd like to see photos from this or other shows, or submit live questions during our next recording, the next time I have a discussion, you can follow Frog Questions on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Snapchat. And if you have a comment about today's show, again, please do comment. Or if you'd like to submit a question of your own for a future show, you can visit frogquestions.com. And we will see you next week.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Frog Questions wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. For more information or to ask a question of your own, please visit frogquestions.com.